Alcácer is the kind of town that exists in thousands of variations across the Spanish interior, a place small enough that everyone knows the name of everyone else's grandmother, that the bar where men play cards on Sunday afternoon is the same bar where their fathers played cards before them, that the arrival of any stranger is noticed before they have walked the length of a single street. It sits in the province of Valencia, about 20 kilometers south of the city, surrounded by flat agricultural land and the particular light of that eastern Mediterranean coast, a light that seems to bleach the sky to a white blue in summer, and that in November arrives at a slant, thin and autumnal, catching the dust on the roads between the orchards. It was the kind of town, in 1992, where parents did not think very much about the safety of their children on a Friday evening, because it was a town where everyone's children had always been safe on Friday evenings, where the worst that could happen on the road between the town square and the local discotheque was a flat tire or a twisted ankle, where the ordinary arithmetic of small-town life had never produced a calculation that included the arrival of something that could not be accounted for within its familiar terms. On the night of the 13th of November, 1992, 3 teenage girls left Alcàsser in the direction of that discotheque, a venue called Coulor, located on the road between the town and the village of Picassent, a few kilometers away. They were hitchhiking, which was in 1992 in this part of Spain, not the act of recklessness it would be understood to be everywhere in the country within a matter of months, but simply a practical solution to the problem of a road with no bus service on a Friday night when the adults who might have driven them were unavailable or simply not asked. Hitchhiking was something that young people did in the towns around Valencia in 1992, the way they had always done it, with the casual trust of people whose daily experience had not yet provided any reason to distrust. A white car stopped for them. Someone in the white car opened a door or a window, and they got in, the 3 of them, because that is what you did when a car stopped on a November night on a dark road and you needed to get somewhere. They were seen getting into the car by several witnesses who would later tell the civil guard what they had seen, witnesses who had no reason at the time to record any detail beyond the fact that 3 girls had gotten a lift, as people always got lifts on that road. The car drove away. The road was dark. The night was ordinary, in the way that all the worst nights in the history of the world have been ordinary up to a specific moment that retrospect transforms into the moment everything changed. Miriam García Iborra was 14 years old. She was the youngest of the 3, a girl whose photograph, which would in the weeks that followed become one of the most reproduced images in Spanish media, shows someone at the specific threshold of adolescence, where childhood is still visibly present in the face, alongside the beginning of something more individual and more formed. She was the daughter of Fernando and Consuelo García, and she lived in Alcácer with her family in the comfortable familiarity of a girl who had grown up in a place where she was known, where the streets had her name in them, in the way that streets in small towns carry the names of the people who have always lived in them. Her father, Fernando, was a man whose grief would become, in the months and years that followed, something public and sustained, and eventually political. A grief that made him one of the most recognized faces in Spain, though not in any way he would ever have chosen. Antonia Gómez Rodríguez, known to everyone as Toñi, was 15 years old. She was the eldest of the 3, and in some accounts, the one who had suggested the evening's plan, the girl who had the specific social energy of 15-year-olds who enjoy organizing, who like being the one who says let's go and means it. She was from a family in Alcácer who had the same roots in the town that most families in Alcácer had, deep and quiet and unremarkable in the way that all the best roots are unremarkable, the kind of belonging that only becomes visible when it is suddenly and catastrophically interrupted. She had brown hair and the particular confidence that some 15-year-olds have when they are among friends they trust completely and in a place they have always known to be safe. Desirée Hernandez Folk was 14 years old. She was the girl in the middle in most senses of the word, the one between the other two in age, the one whose photograph in those first weeks of her absence showed a face that is harder to read than some, a face with a self-possession to it, a kind of inward quality that people who knew her described as thoughtfulness. Her family had lived in Alcàsser in the ordinary way, and she had grown up alongside Miriam and Toñi with the specific closeness that girls in small towns develop when they have been in the same classrooms and the same streets and the same summer afternoons for most of their remembered lives. They had dressed for the night the way teenage girls in 1992 dressed for a Friday at a local discotheque, in the specific combination of style and practicality that constitutes the wardrobe of a 14-year-old going somewhere she is excited to go. Miriam wore a watch, a detail that seems too small to carry any weight until it becomes, months later, the specific detail by which her body is identified in the dark at the bottom of a ravine, the watch on the wrist of a girl who was 14 years old on the last night of her life, keeping time through everything that followed, as though keeping time were still something that mattered. They left Alcàsser. The white car took them. That is the last established fact of the night of the 13th of November, 1992, the last moment in which any of the three girls existed in a form that the world could document, that witnesses could later confirm, that the investigation that would follow could establish as ground truth before the darkness between the known and the unknown closed over everything. Their parents expected them home. Parents do not, in the ordinary course of a Friday evening, sit watching the clock with anything resembling anxiety when they are expecting teenage daughters home from a local discotheque at a reasonable hour in a town they have always considered safe. The specific texture of the evening for the families waiting at home, the gradual shift from the absence of attention to the presence of unease, to the specific moment when someone picks up the phone and makes the first call that begins the long process of understanding that something has gone wrong, is something that no documentation of the case can fully reconstruct, because it lived entirely within the private interior of those households and those families in the hours before the alarm became public. By the following morning, it was clear that the girls had not come home. The civil guard was notified. The search began. And what followed those first hours of the search, spreading outward from Alcàsser in widening circles, expanding from the local to the regional to the national, with a speed that reflected both the specific urgency of three missing teenage girls and the particular moment in Spanish history in which the case arrived, was something that the country had not experienced before and would not quite experience again in the same way, a collective convulsion of fear and attention and grief that lasted for 2.5 months and that changed, in ways both visible and invisible, how Spain understood itself and the world it lived in. To understand what the case meant to Spain in 1992 and 1993, it helps to understand what Spain was in 1992, what kind of country it was, in the specific moment of its history when three girls got into a white car and were taken. Spain in 1992 was a country at the height of a particular optimism, the kind of national confidence that comes from a generation of democratic stabilization and European integration following the long decades of the Franco dictatorship. The kind of country that had hosted the Barcelona Olympics that summer and the Seville Expo, and had felt itself, in the specific vocabulary of that moment, to have arrived, to have become fully European, fully modern, fully part of the family of stable Western democracies in which certain things simply did not happen. It was a country that was still in many ways socially conservative, still deeply organized around the family and the church and the specific moral texture of a society not yet fully secularized, but that was changing, rapidly, in ways that the older generations watched with a mixture of pride and anxiety. Into this moment came the disappearance of 3 girls from a small town near Valencia, and the disappearance hit the country with a force that was partly about the specific horror of what had happened, and partly about what it meant for the specific story Spain had been telling itself about who it was. If this could happen, if 3 girls could vanish from a road in a small town on a Friday night, in a country that had just hosted the Olympics and joined the European project, then the story Spain had been telling itself about its arrival into the safe, modern world had a darker chapter than it had been willing to read. The search mobilized resources at a scale that had not been seen in Spain for a disappearance of this kind. The Civil Guard coordinated search parties across the region, volunteers from Alcàsser and from the surrounding towns, and eventually from much farther afield, came to search the fields and the irrigation channels and the roads and the groves and the places where 3 girls might be if they were somewhere findable. Fernando García, Miriam's father, became very quickly the center of a media campaign that was unprecedented in Spain. A father who went on every television program that would have him, who spoke directly to the camera about his daughter and her friends with a rawness and a persistence that the Spanish media found irresistible and that the public found compelling in the specific way that genuine human grief is always compelling, because it is impossible to watch it and remain entirely at a distance. Fernando García was not a media figure by nature or training. He was a man from a small town whose daughter had vanished, and who understood, with an urgency that came entirely from what had happened to him, that the most powerful tool available to him was the attention of the cameras, that keeping the case in front of the public was the best hope of finding the girls, and that the alternative to using that tool was to wait in his house in Alcàsser, while 75 days passed and nothing changed. He did not wait. He appeared on programs and gave interviews and spoke at events and organized searches and kept the face of his daughter in front of the country with a determination that was, regardless of every other consideration the case would eventually produce, an act of love, as pure as any act of love the record of this case contains. The fear spread. It spread through the villages and towns of the Valencia region first, and then through the rest of Spain, as the weeks passed without the girls being found, without any credible lead producing a resolution, without anything but the ongoing absence of 3 specific young women from the lives that had contained them. Parents who had not previously thought very carefully about the route their children took to a Friday evening's entertainment thought about it now. Young women who had hitchhiked along the roads of the Valencia region the way everyone had always hitchhiked along those roads, began to think about who might stop for them, about what got into a car with you when someone opened a door on a dark road, about whether the car that stopped was safe. The practical, physical habit of a generation changed in those 75 days in ways that are difficult to quantify but that are real, and that people who were teenagers in the Valencia region in 1992 will still describe, decades later, as one of the things the case did to the landscape of ordinary life in that part of Spain. The false leads were many. There were sightings reported that could not be confirmed. There were tip-offs that led to searches that found nothing. There were individuals who were looked at by investigators and cleared, and individuals who were looked at by the public and accused in the specific, irresponsible way that public accusation spreads through communities in crisis. The Civil Guard worked the case with the resources available to it, and those resources were, in the context of a missing persons case in rural Valencia in 1992, not unlimited, and the specific tools and techniques that have since become standard in investigations of this kind were not yet standard then, and the days passed without resolution, and the country waited. On the 27th of January, 1993, 2 beekeepers were checking on hives they maintained in a remote area of ravine terrain near the town of La Romana in the province of Alicante, some distance from Alcàsser, far enough that the connection was not immediately obvious, close enough that it was ultimately traceable. Their names were Juan Rodríguez Fernández and Juan Ruiz Martínez, two men doing the quiet, practical work of tending bees in winter countryside who were not looking for anything beyond the hives they were responsible for. What they found instead, in the ravine, in the winter undergrowth at the bottom of a steep incline, changed their lives in the way that such discoveries change the lives of whoever makes them, irrevocably and without the possibility of return to the state of not knowing. They found remains. They found, among those remains, a wristwatch. The watch that Miriam García Iborra had been wearing on the night of the 13th of November, the watch that had kept time through the 75 days in the ravine while her family and the country looked for her, the watch that became the specific detail by which investigators confirmed what the families had been dreading for 2.5 months. The identity of the remains was established. The search was over in the only way that the evidence at that ravine could make it over, with the knowledge that the 3 girls had been there and that they were not coming back. The discovery of the bodies and the specific circumstances of what had been done to the 3 girls in the time between their disappearance and their deaths produced a response in Spain that went beyond the grief of families, beyond the horror of a criminal case resolved in the worst possible way into something more like a national wound, the specific and public suffering of a country that had been waiting with the specific tension of collective suspense and received the specific and devastating answer that the evidence delivered. The civil guard's initial assessment of the crime scene, the medical and forensic evaluation of what had happened to Miriam and Toñi and Desirée in the days between their abduction and their deaths, established a dimension of cruelty and systematic violence that made the case different in kind from most of the serious crimes that had previously been covered in the Spanish media, different in a way that required a different vocabulary, a heavier weight. The details of what was done to the girls have been described in various media and in the subsequent trial with varying degrees of specificity, and this narration will not add to the gratuitous reproduction of those details, not because they are irrelevant to understanding the case, but because their reproduction in clinical detail serves the horror rather than the understanding, and the understanding is what matters here. What is necessary to say is that the girls were held alive for a period of time after their abduction, that they were subjected to extended violence of a sexual and physical character that constituted, by any moral or legal standard, an extreme act of sustained cruelty, and that their deaths, when they came, followed what the forensic evidence indicated was a period of suffering that no 14 or 15-year-old girl should ever have been made to know. The weight of it sits in the record of this case as the central fact from which everything else, the investigation, the trial, the conspiracy theories, the media coverage, the unresolved questions, radiates outward, and it should sit there with the full gravity it deserves, which is to say the gravity of an act committed against 3 specific people who were 14 and 15 years old, and who had done nothing to bring it upon themselves beyond hitchhiking on a road they had always considered safe. The investigation that followed the discovery of the bodies moved quickly to produce suspects, and what the crime scene yielded proved to be more specific than such scenes usually are. Among the evidence recovered from the ravine and the surrounding area was a glove, and critically, a social security card, or more precisely, a fragment of paper containing a social security number that was traceable through the Spanish bureaucratic records to a specific individual, a man named Francisco García Anglés. Francisco García Anglés was not the person who would become the central figure of the case's criminal dimension, but he was the thread that led to that figure, because Francisco García Anglés had a brother. That brother was Antonio Anglés Martins. Antonio Anglés was born in 1966, one of many children in a family from the Valencian region, a family whose poverty and dysfunction had been the specific background against which a youth of petty crime and institutional encounters had been conducted. He had a record. He had been convicted of multiple offenses including robbery and had served time. He was, by the description that later emerged from those who had encountered him, a man of a specific and unremarkable physical ordinariness, someone who did not attract immediate attention, who could be in a room and not be particularly noticed, who presented the specific social surface of someone managing to pass through the world without generating the kind of impression that people remember with precision. He had a companion. Miguel Ricard was born in 1970 and was by 1992 a young man of 22 with his own record of petty offenses and his own connection to the specific social world of the Valencian margins, the world of men who moved between casual work and petty crime, and the specific social geography of the towns around Valencia, where everyone knew someone who knew someone, and the boundaries between the ordinary and the criminal were not always clearly marked. Ricard and Anglés knew each other, the nature of their relationship, the specific way in which two men with their particular histories came to be together in a white car on a road outside Alcàsser on a November night, is part of the story that the trial and the subsequent investigation attempted to reconstruct, and that the surviving evidence allows to be understood only partially. The civil guard moved to arrest. Miguel Ricard was apprehended. Antonio Anglés was not. He had, by the time investigators came for him, already understood that the discovery of the bodies meant that the investigation was coming, and had made a decision that is in its own way one of the most significant facts in the entire case. A decision that has produced decades of uncertainty and that constitutes, for the families of the three girls, an ongoing injustice that the legal resolution of the case has never fully addressed. He ran, he left, he disappeared. The disappearance of Antonio Anglés from Spain after the discovery of the bodies has produced its own dimension of the case's mystery, a dimension that has expanded over the 3 decades since and that has never been resolved with anything approaching the certainty that his capture and trial would have provided. The most credible account that investigators were eventually able to construct placed him on a ship that traveled from Portugal to Ireland in the weeks following the discovery of the bodies. An ocean crossing made under a false identity. A man traveling in the specific way of someone who understands that if they can put enough water between themselves and the investigation that is coming for them, the water might do a kind of work that no other form of concealment can achieve. The MV Lusitania Expresso, a ferry that operated between Lisbon and Dublin, is the vessel most frequently associated with this account, a ship that apparently carried a passenger who later could not be fully identified by anyone, but whose general description and whose travel documents have been analyzed repeatedly over the years by investigators and journalists trying to establish whether Antonio Anglés made it to Ireland, and if so, what happened to him after he arrived. The Irish authorities cooperated with Spanish investigators. The search extended to the United Kingdom. Interpol was involved. Alerts were issued. International warrants were circulated with the photograph of a man whose face became, in the Spanish press, the face of a fugitive who had somehow escaped the reach of an investigation that had caught his companion and convicted him. No one found him. No credible confirmed sighting ever produced a result. The years have passed, 30 of them now, and Antonio Anglés has not appeared in any jurisdiction, in any documented form, which means either that he is living somewhere under an identity that has never been penetrated, or that he died somewhere, on the sea perhaps, or afterward, and his death has never been documented, and the world has simply continued without the specific closure that his capture and prosecution might have provided. The possibility that he drowned crossing from Portugal to Ireland has been considered seriously by investigators and researchers, and it is a possibility that some have argued is more likely than the alternative of 3 decades of successful concealment. A man with Anglés's background and resources, without the kind of sophisticated support network that successful long-term fugitives typically require. Evading international law enforcement for 30 years is a feat that the history of fugitives suggests is possible, but not common. The sea, by contrast, has its own simple and complete way of resolving the question of whether someone will ever be found. A way that leaves nothing for investigators to follow and no account for families to receive. Miguel Ricart, in custody, was the investigation's primary focus in the months between his arrest and the beginning of the trial. His interrogation produced an account of events that was, in the way of accounts given by people who are trying to manage the specific liability of their situation, partial and self-interested, an account that assigned to Antonio Anglés the primary role in the crimes and that portrayed Ricart's own participation in terms calibrated to limit rather than eliminate his culpability. The forensic evidence gathered at the scene told its own story, a story that was not fully aligned with the account Ricart gave of what had happened, and the investigation worked to establish what the physical evidence demonstrated independently of what Ricart was willing to say. The evidence raised a question that the trial would not fully resolve, and that has remained one of the most disturbing unresolved dimensions of the case ever since. DNA collected at the crime scene, analyzed by forensic experts who testified at the trial, suggested the presence of genetic material from more than 2 individuals. The specific number is contested in various accounts and analyses, but the range suggested by the evidence was, depending on the analytical method and the interpretation of the results, somewhere between 5 and 7 individuals whose DNA was present at or on the victims. If that range is accurate, if the forensic interpretation is correct, then the account of 2 perpetrators that the arrest of Ricart and the flight of Anglés appeared to establish was not the complete account, that there were other men in that ravine on those nights who were never identified, never investigated, never brought to justice. This is the dimension of the case that Fernando García, Miriam's father, pursued with the most sustained urgency in the years after the trial, and that produced the most bitter and the most politically fraught controversy of everything the case generated, which is saying something, because the case generated controversy on a scale that Spain had rarely experienced. Fernando García did not believe that the truth of what had happened to his daughter had been fully established by the trial and the conviction of Ricart. He believed that there were other men whose identities had been known to investigators and had not been pursued, men whose social position or connections had made the investigation unwilling or unable to reach them, and that the story of 2 men from the Valencian margins was a story that the system had found convenient because it was a story that stopped at the right distance from people it was not prepared to identify. He said this publicly, repeatedly, on the same television programs where he had campaigned for the discovery of the girls, with the same directness and the same emotional force that had made him one of the most listened to voices in Spain during the 75 days of the search. He became, in the years after the trial, a figure who divided Spanish public opinion in a way that reflected the division in the case itself, between those who accepted the official account as complete and those who believed that it stopped short of the full truth. He founded a foundation dedicated to keeping the case alive, to advocating for further investigation, to ensuring that the names of Miriam and Toñi and Desirée were not allowed to fade into the category of cases that have been legally resolved and therefore no longer require public attention. The conspiracy theories that developed around the case, and Fernando García was not the only source of them, drew on several specific features of the investigation and the evidence that appeared to some observers to indicate either deliberate concealment or catastrophic investigative failure. The social security number found at the scene, the specific documentary thread that led investigators to the Anglés family, has been examined by various analysts who have asked how a man planning a crime of this kind came to leave behind a document connecting himself to the scene, whether the answer is the ordinary human error that criminals make, or something else. The specific speed with which Anglés disappeared before his arrest has been analyzed by those who believe he had warning, a question that has never been satisfactorily answered. The DNA evidence suggesting multiple perpetrators has been analyzed and debated and disputed and reanalyzed by various experts over the years without producing a consensus that the court found sufficient to extend the investigation. The trial took place between October 1995 and April 1997, more than 4 years after the murders. It was a trial of extraordinary public attention, a trial in which the families of the victims sat in the courtroom and watched the legal machinery of the Spanish state attempt to produce a reckoning for what had been done to their daughters, a machinery that produced, ultimately, the conviction of one man and the acknowledgement that another man who had never been caught was a co-perpetrator, and that left unaddressed the question of whether the conviction of one man and the fugitive status of another constituted an adequate account of what the evidence at the crime scene appeared to suggest. Miguel Ricart was found guilty of the murder of 3 people and was sentenced to 170 years of imprisonment, the maximum sentence available to a Spanish court under the legal framework that governed criminal sentencing at the time. The sentence was, in the specific way that very large prison sentences are symbolic expressions of the court's assessment of the gravity of a crime, rather than literal predictions of how long someone will spend in prison, an expression of condemnation so severe that it required a number that the law could not actually deliver, because no one serves 170 years in a Spanish prison, regardless of what they have done. The sentence communicated what the court wanted to communicate. What it could not communicate was an answer to the questions the evidence raised about who else had been there. He served 21 years. On the 17th of October, 2013, Miguel Ricart was released from prison, the result of a ruling by the European Court of Human Rights on what had become known in Spain as the Parot Doctrine, a legal mechanism that Spanish courts had been using to calculate the sentences of certain prisoners in a way that extended their time in prison beyond what the law in force at the time of their conviction had specified. The ruling found that this method violated the Convention on Human Rights, and Ricart, along with a number of other prisoners whose sentences had been calculated under the Parot Doctrine, was ordered released. His release caused a storm of public anger in Spain that had a particular intensity in the families of his victims, families who had watched 21 years of Ricart's imprisonment as the only form of justice available to them, and who now watched him walk out of prison in circumstances that the legal system had produced, but that no moral framework could make feel adequate to what he had done. Fernando Garcia's response was public and furious, and entirely understandable. He had spent 20 years advocating for the full truth of his daughter's death, and he watched the man convicted of that death become a free man, while the full truth remained unestablished, and while Antonio Anglés remained, somewhere in the world or beneath the sea, beyond the reach of any justice at all. The media dimension of the Alcàsser case is something that, in the long retrospective accounting of the case's significance for Spain, has come to occupy a prominence nearly equal to the case itself, because what the Spanish television did with the case, and specifically what was done on the night of the 27th of January, 1993, the night the bodies were found, became one of the most discussed and most condemned moments in Spanish broadcast history, a moment that changed how the country thought about the relationship between journalism and tragedy, between the public's right to information and the human dignity of the people the information concerned. The program was called De Tú a Tú. The presenter was a journalist, Nieves Herrero, one of the most recognized faces in Spanish television at the time. When the discovery of the bodies in the ravine near La Romana became public on the afternoon of the 27th of January, the program, which was already in production for that evening, made the decision to relocate to the discovery site, to broadcast live from the scene where the remains of 3 teenage girls had just been found. The program aired that night with footage and images from the scene, images that the families of the girls had not seen, and in some cases had not been warned were being broadcast. Images that placed the specific reality of the crime scene in the living rooms of the Spanish public at a moment of extreme and immediate grief, when the country had been told within hours that the bodies had been found and was receiving the news of that finding, while simultaneously being shown the place where the bodies were. The broadcast caused an uproar that did not entirely subside for years. Critics and members of the public, and journalists themselves, debated what had been done, whether it was journalism or voyeurism, whether the public's desire to know and to witness gave television the right to be present at and broadcast from a scene of such intimate and recent horror, whether the families of the 3 girls had any claim to the dignity of a private grief in a case that had been conducted in public for 75 days. Nieves Herrero faced sustained public criticism. The program faced criticism. The broadcaster faced criticism. A debate about the ethics of Spanish television journalism was conducted across the following weeks and months, with a heat that reflected how deeply the broadcast had disturbed people who watched it, even people who had no personal connection to the case, people whose reaction to what they saw on their television screens that night was something close to shame, not for the families, but for the medium that had put those images there. The debate produced, eventually, various professional codes and guidelines and discussions about the limits of what journalism could legitimately do in the coverage of cases involving the deaths of private individuals, particularly minors. Whether those codes and guidelines have produced a durable change in practice is a question that the subsequent decades of Spanish television have answered imperfectly, with examples of both restraint and excess that suggest the lesson was learned and then partially unlearned in the way that lessons learned from individual cases often are, through the specific institutional memory that fades as the people who carried it retire or move on. Fernando García did not retire or move on. He has not moved on. He cannot move on, because moving on from a daughter requires a completeness of knowledge and a completeness of justice that he does not have and has never been given. In the years since the trial, he has continued to raise questions about the DNA evidence and about the possible involvement of additional perpetrators, has continued to insist that the case that was presented to the court and the case that the evidence at the crime scene suggests are not the same case, has continued to use the public platform that his grief and his advocacy built for him to demand an accounting that the legal system has not produced. The Spanish judicial system has not reopened the case in response to these demands, has not found the DNA evidence sufficient to require a fresh investigation, has not produced the additional proceedings that Fernando García believes the evidence warrants. The reasons for this are multiple, and not all of them reflect the kind of deliberate concealment that the more extreme versions of the conspiracy theory allege. Forensic DNA evidence from 1992 crime scenes carries specific methodological limitations. The interpretation of mixed DNA profiles, particularly from samples collected under field conditions at a crime scene in 1993, is subject to genuine scientific debate about what the evidence establishes and what it permits as inference. The legal standard of proof that would be required to support additional prosecutions is high, and the evidence as it exists may not meet it. These are real considerations, and they exist alongside the other consideration, which is that the families of 3 girls who were murdered in a ravine in 1992 have spent 30 years asking questions that the system has not answered to their satisfaction, and that this failure, whatever its cause, is its own kind of injustice. The case of the Alcàsser girls has been the subject of documentary treatment in Spain and internationally, most notably in a Netflix documentary series released in 2019 that brought the case to an international audience for the first time at any scale. The documentary, which aired the surviving evidence and testimony and the current state of knowledge about the case, prompted a new wave of public discussion in Spain and drew in audiences elsewhere who encountered the case without the specific personal and national emotional weight that Spaniards bring to it, audiences who could engage with it as historical true crime rather than as living national trauma. The reaction to the documentary, particularly in Spain, was complicated, mixing appreciation for the renewed attention with criticism of specific choices the documentary made in handling the evidence and the surviving family members' accounts. Criticism that reflects the ongoing sensitivity in Spain about how this particular case is presented and by whom. Antonio Anglés would be in his late 50s now, if he is alive. The photograph that was distributed by Interpol and circulated in Spanish media in the years following the murders showed a face that has aged in theory, if not in any verified photographic record, through the decades since. Age progression imaging has been produced that attempts to show what he might look like now, the specific softening and weathering that time does to faces, the way the distinctive features of a 30-year-old become the distinctive features of a 60-year-old through the gradual work of the years. Whether that face exists somewhere in the world, attached to a person living a life under a name that is not his own, or whether the progression from the 30-year-old in the photograph to the 60-year-old in the age progression image never occurred, whether the progression was interrupted by the sea or by something else, is a question that 3 decades of investigation across multiple countries and 2 continents has not answered. The Spanish authorities have not formally closed the search for Antonio Anglés. He remains the subject of an international arrest warrant. His name remains in the Interpol database. The legal instruments that would bring him to trial exist and remain in force, waiting for the specific piece of information that would convert them from dormant instruments into active ones. The confirmed sighting, the documentary connection, the moment when the 30 years of invisibility come to an end and the person in the age-progressed photograph is found to correspond to an actual living human being in an actual identifiable location. He may never be found. This is a sentence that the families of 3 girls deserve to have stated directly rather than left as an implication, because the possibility that it is true is one they have lived with for 3 decades, and that the honesty of any account of this case requires to be named. He may be dead. He may be alive somewhere that will not be found. The case may end, for the surviving families, not with the resolution of his capture and prosecution, but with the passage of enough time that the resolution becomes impossible to deliver, even in theory, with the eventual deaths of everyone who knew him and who was in that ravine in 1992, and who might in some possible world have told the full truth about what happened there. The case changed Spain. This is said about cases that change countries often enough that it risks becoming a formula, but in the specific instance of the Alcàsser murders, the claim has sufficient texture and evidence behind it to be worth examining at length. Spain in 1993 was a different country from Spain in 1992, and part of the difference was what the case had done to the specific national conversation about safety and childhood, and the relationship between the world that adults create and the world that children inhabit within it. The specific act of hitchhiking, which had been a generation's casual practice along the roads of rural Spain, effectively ended as a practice among young women in the regions most affected by the case, and the awareness of what the case had demonstrated about what could happen on a dark road was not something that time and distance simply dissolved, but rather something that persisted in the specific caution of a generation that had learned about it at an impressionable age. The media coverage changed the specific relationship between Spanish television and its audience in ways that continued to be worked out across the following decade and beyond. In the specific debates about what journalism owed to victims and to the public and to the truth, in the specific codes and guidelines and institutional practices that were developed partly in response to what happened on the night of the 27th of January, 1993. The legal and political dimensions of the case continued, in Fernando García's advocacy, and in the ongoing public attention to the DNA evidence and the unanswered questions about additional perpetrators, to complicate the simple narrative of a resolved criminal case with the persistent possibility that the resolution was incomplete, that the full account of what happened in that ravine had never been established, that the justice delivered was partial in ways that the evidence available could not fully disprove. With the foundation and advocacy organizations that emerge partly from the public anger and public grief generated by the Alcàsser case changed the landscape of victim advocacy in Spain in ways that are difficult to trace with precision, but that are visible in the subsequent history of how Spain legislates for and discusses violence against women and children. Miriam García Iborra was 14 years old. Antonia Gómez Rodríguez was 15 years old. Desirée Hernández Folch was 14 years old. They were born in Alcàsser, and they grew up in Alcàsser, and they put on their clothes for a Friday night, and they stood on a road in the dark in November, and a car stopped for them, and they got in, because that was what you did, because that was how the world had always worked, in the specific place they lived, and the specific time they lived in, because nothing in their experience had given them a reason to be afraid of a car stopping on a road to a discotheque, because they were 14 and 15, and everything in the ordinary world they had known their entire lives had prepared them for an evening out and home again by midnight. They did not come home by midnight. They did not come home at all, and the watch that Miriam was wearing kept time through the 75 days of their absence, and was the specific detail by which she was given back to her family in the only form remaining available, the form of confirmed knowledge rather than living presence, the form of an ending rather than a continuation. The watch was still there. The watch had not left the ravine. The watch was the specific object that made the worst possible knowledge certain, that transformed the suspension of not knowing into the certainty of knowing, a certainty that no family wants, and that this family had nonetheless been given. Fernando García has not stopped asking questions. He has asked them in public and in private, and in courtrooms and in television studios, and through the foundation that carries his daughter's name, alongside the names of the other two girls, and the questions he asks are the same questions that the DNA evidence raises, and that the flight of Antonio Anglés makes impossible to fully answer, and that the conviction of Miguel Ricart does not render unnecessary. He asks them because the alternative to asking them is accepting that the full truth of what happened to his daughter will never be known, and he has not accepted that, and it is not clear that the years have moved him any closer to accepting it, or that any amount of time will. 3 families, 31 years, 3 girls who were 14 and 15 years old on the 13th of November 1992, and who have been 14 and 15 years old in the record of that night forever since, preserved at that specific age in the photographs that Spain has carried forward in its collective memory of the case, faces of girls on the threshold of the lives that were taken from them on a road outside a small town near Valencia. Antonio Anglés has not been found. The DNA evidence has not produced additional prosecutions. Miguel Ricart has been free since 2013. The questions have not been answered. The case is open in the sense that it has never been fully and finally resolved to the satisfaction of the evidence or of the families, and the case is closed in the sense that the legal machinery has done what it did and stopped, and nothing that Fernando García or the surviving families have done or said in 30 years has caused it to begin again. The white car drove away down the dark road outside Alcàsser on the night of the 13th of November, 1992, and took 3 girls with it, and the road was the same road it had always been, the same road that ran through the same flat agricultural land between the same small towns in the same eastern Mediterranean light, the road that everyone had always traveled on Friday evenings because it was the road to the discotheque, and it was safe, and nothing ever happened on it that a person could not account for in the ordinary terms of the ordinary world. The white car drove away down that road and turned somewhere and went somewhere that the road does not lead to, somewhere outside the ordinary geography of what that road meant to the people who had always used it, somewhere that only became part of the geography of that road after the night in question, and that has remained part of it, a point on the map that has no physical marker and no coordinate, the point at which the ordinary world became the other thing, the point at which a November Friday became the night that will not end. The night has not ended. It has been 31 years, and the night of the 13th of November, 1992, has not ended for the families in Alcàsser, has not ended in the record of the case, has not ended in the ongoing search for a fugitive who disappeared before he could be caught, has not ended in the DNA analysis that suggested more perpetrators and found none of the additional perpetrators it suggested, has not ended in the public argument about what Spanish television did with the discovery of the bodies, or what the Spanish justice system did with the evidence of additional involvement, or what Spain did with the specific national grief of those 75 days. It has not ended because it has not been completed, because the 3 girls have not received the full account of what was done to them, and why, and by how many people. Because one of the men who was there has never been brought to justice. Because the evidence that others were there has never been resolved into names and arrests and prosecutions. Because Fernando García has been asking a question for 31 years, and the answer that the system has given him is not the answer that the evidence requires, and he knows it, and he has never stopped saying so, and he has been right, that the full truth has not been established, and the full truth has not been established. Through girls, a Friday night, a white car, a dark road, a ravine, a watch that kept time until it didn't need to anymore, until someone came to the ravine and found it and knew what it meant, and the 75 days of not knowing became the rest of time knowing, and Spain knew too, and the knowledge changed the country in ways that are still being worked out in the specific decisions of a generation that was young in 1992, in the specific advocacy of a father who has not stopped, in the specific silence of a fugitive who has never been found, and in the specific and permanent absence of 3 specific people from the world that had the specific misfortune of losing them in the most terrible way, on the most ordinary of nights, on the most familiar of roads, in a small town where everyone knew everyone, and nothing like this had ever happened before and has not happened since, because the world that made it possible to happen once does not make it possible to unhappen, even after 31 years, even after everything that has been done to try. The road is still there. The town is still there. The families are still there, or what remains of them after 31 years of carrying what they carry. The watch is in an evidence archive somewhere, still marking the moment it stopped, still the specific object that turned 75 days of hope into knowledge, still the detail that makes the abstraction of a cold case file into the reality of a girl who was 14 years old and wore a watch and went out on a Friday night and did not come home. Antonio Anglés is somewhere, or he is nowhere. The difference between those 2 possibilities is the last unanswerable question in a case that has more unanswerable questions than most, and it is the question that sits at the center of the case's permanent irresolution. The question that the surviving families will probably never have answered with the certainty they deserve. The question that the world has been unable to settle in 3 decades of search and warrant and Interpol bulletin and age progression photograph and investigative cooperation across borders and oceans. Miriam, Toñi, Desirée, 14 and 15 years old, forever, in the record of a November night that has never ended. To understand the full weight of what happened in the Valencian countryside in November of 1992, and what it meant for the families who lived through it and the country that watched it, it is necessary to spend more time with each of the 3 girls, not as the photographs that became iconic, not as the names at the bottom of memorial plaques, but as the specific and particular human beings they were in the days before the 13th of November, the days when they were simply 3 teenagers growing up in a town that had not yet become the town where this happened. Miriam García Iborra attended school in the ordinary way of a 14-year-old in the early 1990s, navigating the specific social geography of an adolescence in a small Spanish town, the friendships and the small dramas and the particular pleasures and frustrations of being 14 in a place where everyone knows your name, and sometimes this is a comfort, and sometimes it is not. She had interests and preferences, and the specific kind of future that is still entirely open at 14. The future that is not yet shaped by any particular choice, but that presents itself as full of choices, as a landscape without a single fixed path through it, as possibility itself, before possibility, has been narrowed by the specific decisions of a life actually lived. Her father Fernando has spoken, in various contexts and interviews across the decades since, about the specific person she was, about the things she cared about, and the way she moved through the world, about the particular quality of her presence that no photograph quite captures, and that he carries in the specific form of a living memory, that time does not erode, but that the absence of the person it refers to makes heavier with each passing year. Toñi Gómez Rodríguez was the eldest, 15 years old, a year older than the other 2, in a way that at 15 feels significant, the kind of year that separates the second year of secondary school from the third, that places you in a slightly different social bracket within the peer group, that gives you the specific status of being a little ahead. She had the energy and the organizational instinct that her friends and family described, the quality of someone who makes things happen, who suggests the plan and follows through on it, who is the one who says it is time to go, and then makes sure everyone is ready to go. She was, by the accounts of those who knew her, someone who would have been interesting to know at 30, at 40, at any of the ages she never reached, someone whose particular quality of aliveness was visible enough at 15 that the people around her were already looking forward to what she would do with it. Desirée Hernández Folch was thoughtful in the way that some 14-year-olds are, in the way that suggests a person who is already developing the specific interiority that some people carry through their lives as a primary feature of who they are, the quality of someone who notices things and considers them before responding, who is not the first one to speak in a group, but whose contribution, when it comes, tends to be more considered than the first one's. She had the specific closeness with Miriam and Toñi that comes from years of shared experience in a place small enough that shared experience accumulates faster than it does in larger, more anonymous settings, the kind of friendship that is not easily explained to people who did not grow up in small towns because it is partly about geography as much as about choice. The friendship that forms when there are only so many people your age in a given radius, and you find among them the specific ones who fit. The 3 of them together constituted a particular and irreplaceable social unit, the kind of unit that small towns produce and that the people in small towns recognize as a feature of their landscape, the group of girls who are always together, who share a table at the cafe and walk the town's evening paseo together, and whose names are linked in conversation, the way names in small towns get linked, not by any formal declaration, but by the simple repetition of seeing them together that eventually makes the group a social fact rather than a collection of individuals. They were that kind of group. They were that kind of friends. The 13th of November was a Friday evening that they were spending together, because that is what they did on Friday evenings, because there was a discotheque on the road to Picassent, and because they were 15 and 14, and the evening offered the specific pleasure of being young and out and together in the way that is only possible at exactly that age, and that you do not fully appreciate until you are well past it. The road they walked to the hitchhiking point was a road they had walked before. This is the detail that sits in the account of the evening with the particular weight of the familiar turned dangerous, the weight of the knowledge that the very ordinariness of what they were doing, the repetition of a route they had taken before, the casual confidence of people who know where they are going and have been there before, was part of what made them available to the car that stopped, not through any failure of their own judgment or any insufficient caution, but through the simple mathematical fact that nothing in their experience had given them a reason to approach a car stopping on that road with anything other than the openness of people for whom the world has always worked as it was supposed to work. The car stopped. They got in. The specific moment of that decision, the moment at which the door opened and they moved toward it, is the moment that Fernando Garcia has returned to in the years since. The moment that parents who have lost children to violence return to in the way that people return to the specific point of fracture when they are trying to understand how a thing that should not have happened, happened, as though the moment itself contains an answer that looking at it long enough will eventually reveal. It does not contain an answer. The answer to why 3 girls got into a car on a road outside Alcàsser on the night of November 13, 1992, is that they were teenagers in a small Spanish town who were going to a discotheque and a car stopped and they got in. Because that was what you did. Because the world they lived in had not yet told them not to. The social context of hitchhiking in Spain in 1992 is worth dwelling on, because it is a context that has been almost entirely erased by the case itself, erased with such thoroughness that it is difficult for a generation that grew up after the case to fully imagine it as something other than an obviously dangerous act. In the towns and villages of the Valencia region in the early 1990s, hitchhiking was a practice that crossed generational and social lines in a way that made it simply a feature of getting around in areas where public transport was limited and where the density of social connection in small communities meant that the cars that stopped were frequently driven by people who knew who you were or who knew someone who knew you. It was a practice embedded in a social world where the car that stopped was usually a neighbor's car, or a cousin's friend's car, or at worst, the car of someone whose face you did not know, but whose presence on that particular road made them a member of the same local geography you belonged to. The white car that stopped on the 13th of November was not part of that geography. It came from somewhere else, carried people who were not part of the social world that made hitchhiking feel safe, and it used the trust that the practice of hitchhiking encoded to access 3 girls who had no mechanism for recognizing, in the moment of the car stopping, that the car was different from the cars that had always stopped safely before. This is not a complexity that the girls should have been required to navigate. It is a complexity that the case exposed in the specific practice of hitchhiking in rural Spain, and that the case effectively ended, and that the ending of it represented a specific loss of the specific freedom that the practice had encoded, the freedom to move through a familiar landscape with the trust of someone in whose experience that landscape has always been safe. The 75 days of the search were, in the daily texture of life in Alcàsser and in the surrounding region, something different from what the media coverage of them suggests in retrospect. The media coverage was national and organized and followed the specific grammar of a news story with a clear emotional center, the missing girls and the grieving father and the search and the country's collective engagement with the outcome. The daily life of the search in Alcàsser was something more local and more intimate, the specific texture of a small town living through a crisis that was simultaneously the most extraordinary thing that had ever happened to it, and a thing that was happening in the middle of all the ordinary things, the school and the work and the food and the sleep that people continued to do because life does not pause for grief, even grief of this magnitude and this specificity. The people who participated in the searches, who came out on weekends and some days after work to walk the irrigation channels and the orange groves and the dried riverbeds and the tracks between the fields, were people from the town and from the surrounding region who brought with them the specific bodily knowledge of local geography, the knowledge of which turnoffs led to which places, and which parts of the landscape could hide something, and which could not. They searched with the combination of purpose and dread that characterizes all searches in which the searchers both desperately want to find what they are looking for and are terrified of what finding it will mean, the specific suspension of hope and fear that 75 days sustains, and that is one of the most psychologically difficult sustained states that human beings can occupy. Fernando García in those 75 days was on the television programs and at the press conferences and at the organized searches, but he was also in Alcàsser, living in the same house where Miriam had grown up, looking at her room and her things and the specific evidence of a life interrupted in the middle of a Friday evening that had been entirely ordinary up to the moment it stopped being ordinary. He has described the quality of those days in terms that people who have lost children to sudden violence will recognize. The way the world simultaneously continues and has stopped. The way you go through the motions of daily life with the specific unreality of someone who cannot fully inhabit the present because the present has been made uninhabitable by what has happened in it. The way every ordinary action, making coffee, answering the phone, getting dressed, is both necessary and absurd in the context of the overwhelming fact of the absence. The television appearances in those days were, for Fernando García, a form of action in the face of paralysis, a way of doing something when everything else felt like waiting. He appeared on programs that reached millions of people, and he spoke about Miriam and about Toñi and about Desirée, with a specificity and an emotion that programs' producers and the viewing public found irresistible, and that kept the case in front of the country through the weeks when cases begin to fade from the headlines because nothing new has happened to keep them there. He was not performing grief for the cameras. He was bringing his actual grief to the cameras because the cameras were the most powerful tool available to him, and he understood how to use them, or learned how to use them in those weeks, in the specific way that necessity teaches things that no other teacher could. The decision of De Tú a Tú to broadcast live from the scene of the discovery on the evening of January 27th, 1993, has been analyzed from multiple angles in the years since, and the analysis has not produced a consensus that the decision was simply wrong, though the majority view has been that it crossed a line that journalism should not cross. The tension at the center of the debate is genuine. The families had used the media, had invited the media into their grief, had appeared on exactly these kinds of programs in the preceding months as a strategy for keeping the case public. The question of whether this invitation extended to the broadcast of crime scene images from the site where their daughters' bodies had just been found is a question about the nature of consent that the parties have never fully agreed on. What the families have said, with considerable consistency, is that they did not consent to those specific images being broadcast, that the intimacy of the media's involvement in their search did not encompass the intimacy of the media's presence at the discovery of the bodies, and that the broadcast caused them harm in ways that no journalistic justification could adequately offset. The broader debate about the broadcast became a debate about Spanish television culture in the early 1990s, about the specific competitive dynamics of a newly liberalized television market in which commercial channels were competing aggressively for audiences and in which the emotional intensity of a case like the Alcàsser murders was, from a purely commercial perspective, an extraordinary resource to be deployed. The specific pressures that produced the decision to go live from the ravine were not simply about journalistic judgment, but about commercial calculation, about the understanding that the country had been following this case for 75 days, and that the moment of resolution, however terrible, was the moment of maximum audience, and that maximum audience demanded maximum presence. That calculation, and what it produced, is part of what changed when the debate that followed the broadcast worked its way through Spanish journalism, though the change, as noted, was incomplete and was partially reversed by subsequent competitive pressures that recreated the conditions from which the original decision emerged. The Civil Guard investigators who worked the case in the months between the discovery of the bodies and the trial have given, in various later accounts, a picture of the investigation that is more complicated than the story of the Social Security number and the arrest of Ricard suggests in its simple outline. The evidence at the scene was not limited to the documentary evidence that led to the Anglés family. It included physical evidence whose processing, under the forensic capabilities of 1993, produced results that raised the question of additional perpetrators immediately, in the first weeks of the investigation, before the trial had begun, and before the DNA analysis had been fully completed and submitted to the court. The investigators were aware, from early in the post-discovery phase of the investigation, that the evidence suggested more than 2 people had been present. What they did with that awareness, and why the investigation did not extend further, is the dimension of the case that Fernando García has pressed most consistently, and that the institutional response has most consistently deferred. The forensic debate around the DNA evidence has been sustained in Spain for 3 decades by the specific technical questions the evidence raises and by the specific difficulty of resolving those questions under the methodological constraints of the original analysis. DNA profiling in 1993 was not the technology that DNA profiling has become in the years since, and what the original analysis could establish and what it could not establish are questions that have been revisited by subsequent analysts, working from the original samples with improved methodologies and that have not produced a definitive revision of the original findings. The range of 5 to 7 contributors suggested by various analyses has remained the contested center of the evidence's interpretation, contested not in the sense of being disproven, but in the sense of being methodologically uncertain at the specific threshold required for criminal prosecution. Miguel Ricard's years in prison were years about which relatively little entered the public record in Spain, partly because Ricard himself was not a media figure in the way that Gacy or Bundy or other convicted killers in Anglo-American true crime tradition have been, partly because the Spanish media's attention to the case focused primarily on the families and on Fernando García's advocacy rather than on the imprisoned perpetrator. He served his sentence at various institutions in the Spanish prison system, living the specific, constrained life of a long-sentence prisoner, while the families whose daughters he had killed lived the specific, constrained life of people for whom the legal machinery of the state had produced a verdict, but not a resolution. His release in 2013 produced a media event of its own, the photograph of him emerging from the prison that was broadcast on a Spanish television with the same immediacy and the same lack of contextualizing distance that the case had always attracted, an image that placed the living body of a free man in the same visual field as the memory of 3 girls who had been 14 and 15 years old in the last photograph anyone had taken of them alive. The family's response to his release was reported with the same attention that his release itself received, and Fernando García's specific reaction, which was public and sustained and furious, became one more moment in the 3 decades of his public engagement with the case, one more occasion on which the inadequacy of the legal resolution was visible and documented and made part of the ongoing record of what the case had produced and what it had failed to produce. The Netflix documentary El Caso Alcácer released in 2009, brought a generation of Spanish viewers to the case who had been too young to remember it in 1992 and 1993, and brought international viewers to it for the first time. The documentary was watched and discussed, and generated the specific kind of online conversation that true crime documentary series generate in the streaming era. The conversation that mixes genuine engagement with the horror of the case, with the distancing that comes from consuming that horror as content. The conversation that circles the central question, the question of what happened and who is responsible, without ever arriving at an answer that the evidence supports with sufficient certainty to close it. The Spanish response to the documentary was more complicated than the international response, reflecting the specific relationship that Spaniards of a certain generation have with the case, a relationship built not from watching a documentary series, but from living through the weeks and months of the original events, from the specific embodied memory of watching the news and hearing about the search, and eventually sitting in front of a television on the original events. For those people, the documentary was not an introduction, but a revisiting, a return to something that had not been left behind, and the return produced reactions that ranged from the cathartic to the simply painful, the reactivation of a grief and a horror that had been managed but not resolved across the intervening years. Fernando García appeared in the documentary and continued, in it, the advocacy that he has sustained for 3 decades, the insistence that the full truth of what happened to his daughter and her friends has not been established, and that the establishment of that truth remains a moral obligation that the Spanish justice system has not yet met. His presence in the documentary, his continued engagement with the case, at an age when most men have accepted whatever resolution life has offered them and turned their attention to other things, is itself a form of testimony. Testimony to what the case did to him and to what he believes the case still requires of the world in which it occurred. He is correct that the full truth has not been established. The DNA evidence, whatever methodological caveats apply to its interpretation, suggests that the account of 2 perpetrators is incomplete. Antonio Anglés has never been found and therefore never been required to give an account of what he knows, an account that, whatever its self-serving dimensions, would add to the record in ways that the record currently lacks. The questions about how Anglés came to be warned of the investigation before it reached him, if he was warned, have never been answered. The questions about whether additional perpetrators were identified by investigators and not pursued have never been answered. The case is open, technically and morally, in ways that the legal system's closure of it does not alter. 3 families have lived with this for 31 years, the specific shape of 31 years of unresolved grief, of grief that coexists with ongoing public attention and ongoing advocacy and ongoing unanswered questions, is something that no external account can fully inhabit. Fernando García has been the most visible of the surviving family members, but the mothers and the fathers and the siblings and the extended families of Toñi Gómez Rodríguez and Desirée Hernández Folch have lived alongside the same grief and the same unresolved questions, with less public visibility but no less weight, and their 31 years are part of the case's record in ways that the emphasis on Fernando García's advocacy sometimes obscures. The town of Alcàsser itself has carried the case in its own specific way, the way that small towns carry the extraordinary things that have happened in them, by incorporating them into the permanent fabric of what the town is and what it has been, by having the case be something that residents know about, not from documentaries or news coverage, but from having been there, from having been part of the community when it happened, from having known the families, or the girls, or the road, or the Friday nights on which teenagers went to the Couleur discotheque and came home again. The town is still Alcàsser. It is also the town where 3 girls disappeared in 1992, permanently, in both senses of the word, because the name of the town and the name of the case have been linked in Spanish public consciousness since the 75 days of the search, and the linkage does not dissolve with time, but rather becomes more fixed, more definitional, more part of what the word Alcàsser carries when it is spoken. The road between Alcàsser and Picassent is still there. People still drive it. It is a provincial road in the Valencia region, passing through the flat agricultural landscape of orange groves and market gardens that has always been the geography of this part of Spain, a road without any physical memorial or marker that distinguishes the point at which three girls hitchhiked toward a discotheque on a November night in 1992. The road does not know what it witnessed. Roads do not know things. But the people who drive it, particularly the people who were alive and aware in 1992 and who have driven that road in the years since, carry in the act of driving it something that the road itself does not carry, the knowledge of what happened on it, the specific awareness that makes an ordinary provincial road in the Valencia countryside into a different kind of place, a place where something that should not have happened did happen, and where the world in which it happened was not the world it appeared to be. The watch that Miriam was wearing is in an evidence archive. The white car is in whatever form cars that are used as evidence in 30-year-old criminal cases eventually come to rest in, the dismantled, or the destroyed, or the stored, time doing to it what time does to the physical objects of cases that have been tried and sentenced and closed as far as the courts are concerned. The three girls are in the record that this case has produced, in the photographs and the testimony and the searches and the 75 days and the ravine and the beekeepers and the DNA and the trial and the conviction and the release and the ongoing search for a fugitive who has been invisible for 3 decades. They are in the specific advocacy of a father who has spent more years asking questions about his daughter's death than his daughter had years of life. They are in the specific change that the case made to Spain, in the habits and the laws and the journalism ethics debates and the victim advocacy landscape that the country has built, partly in response to what happened to 3 girls on a Friday night on a road outside a small town near Valencia. The night of the 13th of November, 1992, has not ended. It is still going on in the specific way that nights like that one go on, in the permanent present tense of the unresolved, in the ongoing absence of 3 people whose presence in the world was ended by what happened after the white car drove away. Miriam and Toñi and Desirée are 14 and 15 years old in the record of that night, and they will always be 14 and 15 years old in that record, preserved at the exact point at which the future stopped arriving for them, at the exact age they were when the night began and did not end. Antonio Anglés is somewhere or nowhere, alive or dead, traceable or permanently beyond reach. The question of which is true is the last question the case has yet to answer, and the families have been waiting 31 years for the answer, with the specific patience of people who have had no alternative to waiting and who have continued to ask anyway, because asking is what remains when everything else that might be done has been done. Miriam, Toñi, Desirée, the names sit in the record of the case with the weight of everything they were and everything they were not allowed to become. They are the beginning and the end of the story, whatever the story contains between those 2 fixed points. They are the reason the story is told, and the reason the questions matter, and the reason the unresolved case cannot be left to the administrative convenience of a closed file and a released prisoner and a fugitive presumed dead by the passage of time alone. They were 3 girls on a Friday night in a small town in Spain, and they deserved to come home, and they did not, and everything else in the case, every theory and every conviction, and every unanswered question, and every documentary and every anniversary, and every press conference and every Interpol bulletin, and every age progression photograph, Is the world attempting, across 3 decades and with insufficient success, to respond adequately to that specific, irreversible fact? The institutional response to the Alcàsser case in Spain over the 3 decades since extends beyond the criminal justice system to include legislative changes, policy reforms, and the specific evolution of how the Spanish state approaches violence against women and children in legal and social frameworks that were, in 1992, considerably less developed than they became in the years that followed. The case did not cause these changes alone, but it contributed to a climate of public attention and political pressure that made certain changes possible that might otherwise have taken longer to achieve. Changes in the laws governing sex crimes, changes in the protections available to victims of violence and their families, changes in the specific institutional treatment of cases involving the disappearance of minors that have, in subsequent cases, produced outcomes different from what the Alcàsser investigation produced. These changes are part of what Fernando García's advocacy helped produce, alongside the advocacy of the families of other victims of violence in Spain in the same period. They are part of what the case contributed to the country that experienced it, part of the answer to the question of what a tragedy of this scale leaves behind in a society that is forced to confront it. The answer is never entirely satisfying because no legislative reform and no policy change returns 3 girls to their families or delivers the full truth of what happened to them in that ravine. But the changes are real, and they have had real effects, and the people who were involved in producing them have pointed consistently to the Alcàsser case as one of the events that made their work possible and that gave it the specific urgency that political change requires. The case also produced a specific change in the relationship between a Spanish society and the phenomenon that the case exemplified, which is the sexual violence committed against female victims by perpetrators who are strangers or near strangers rather than intimate partners or family members. The public conversation about violence against women in Spain in 1992 was dominated, as it was in most Western countries, by the question of domestic violence, the violence of partners and husbands, the specific violence of the private sphere that feminist advocates had been working for decades to bring into the public sphere of legal attention and institutional response. The Alcàsser case brought into that conversation a different category of violence, the violence of strangers who prey on women and girls in public spaces, and it brought it in the most dramatic and most unignorable way possible, through the specific case of 3 girls on a road who were taken by people they did not know and who did not come home. The conversation that the case opened about public space and female safety, about the specific conditions that made young women in particular vulnerable to the kind of violence that occurred on the road outside Alcàsser, contributed to a broader feminist reconsideration in Spain of the relationship between public space and gender, of the extent to which the city and the countryside and the road and the park and the bus stop were genuinely public and accessible to women in the same way they were accessible to men, or whether the fear of violence that the Alcàsser case both reflected and intensified was itself a form of confinement, a limitation on female freedom, enforced not by law, but by the specific threat that the case had made undeniable. This conversation has continued in Spain across the decades since, in forms that have become more sophisticated and more politically developed as the feminist movement in Spain has grown in visibility and influence. In the specific Spanish context that produced the massive feminist mobilizations of the 2010s and the legislative reforms of the same period, the Alcàsser case is not the origin of that conversation, but it is one of the specific events in its history, one of the moments when the abstract became concrete and the political became personal, in the specific way that cases involving the deaths of young women make things concrete and personal, for women who see in the victims something of themselves, and for families who understand that the vulnerability the case documented is not specific to the 3 girls who were killed, but is shared by girls Antonio Anglés would now be in his late 50s. He has been a fugitive for 31 years, which is longer than many people in his social world in 1992 had been alive. The specific endurance of his disappearance, whatever its cause, is itself a feature of the case that requires acknowledgement, not because it is admirable, but because it is real, and because it has consequences for the families and for the legal and moral accounting the case A fugitive who remains unfound for 31 years is either alive and successful in maintaining concealment, or dead in circumstances that have not been documented, and both possibilities leave the case in a state of irresolution that the families cannot accept as final, and that the justice system cannot, in good conscience, treat as equivalent to resolution. The sea between Portugal and Ireland is the specific geography most frequently associated with the theory of his death, the water that might have received him in the weeks following the discovery of the bodies, if the MV Lusitania Expresso account is accurate, and if he did not survive whatever crossing he attempted or completed. The Irish Sea in January and February is cold and often rough, and a man traveling without proper documentation and possibly under conditions of considerable stress is not a man ideally equipped for the specific challenges of ocean crossing in winter, even on a commercial ferry. The possibility that the crossing ended badly, that the water received someone who had been a fugitive for weeks and returned nothing to the surface that could be identified, is a possibility that the investigation has taken seriously while being unable to confirm. If he survived to reach Ireland, what happened next is unknown. Irish authorities searched for him. British authorities searched for him. No confirmed trace was ever found. The possibility that he built a life somewhere in the British Isles under an assumed identity, supported by the specific community of emigrants from Spain and Latin America that was present in those countries in the 1990s, is a possibility that the investigation explored without finding evidence that confirmed it. The possibility that he left the British Isles and traveled further, to South America, to other European countries, to anywhere that the specific logistical challenges of a fugitive with no official identity could be navigated with the help of people or circumstances the investigation never identified, is a possibility that the specific absence of evidence neither supports nor eliminates. He is a question mark. He has been a question mark for 3 decades. The specific shape of that question mark, the silhouette of a man who was present at the crime and who has never been required to account for that presence, is one of the shapes that the case casts on the wall of Spanish history, one of the permanent features of the case's unresolved landscape. The families of the 3 girls deserve the answer. They have deserved it for 31 years. The specific question of when, if ever, they will receive it, whether through the capture and prosecution of Antonio Anglés, through a posthumous identification of his remains, through a deathbed confession, or a documentary revelation, or some other mechanism that delivers facts where there are currently only hypotheses, is a question that the evidence does not allow to be answered with any confidence. The case is open. The questions are open. The families are still asking. Alcàsser is still a town in the province of Valencia, still surrounded by the flat agricultural landscape, and still lit by the particular Eastern Mediterranean light that arrives in autumn at a slant, catching the dust on the roads between the orchards. The town goes about its life in the way that towns go about their lives, with the ordinary daily business of people living together in a small place, and in that life the case is always present, in the way that extraordinary things are always present in the places where they happened, in the weight of what the place knows about itself and what it cannot forget. The 13th of November comes every year. Each year it is 31 years, 32 years, the accumulation of calendar distance between the ordinary Friday evening when 3 girls left a small town near Valencia and the present. The distance does not resolve the case. It does not deliver the answers. It does not find Antonio Anglés or establish the full account of what happened in the ravine near La Romana, or give back to 3 families the completeness of knowledge that would constitute, at minimum, the factual foundation of whatever justice might eventually be possible. It only adds another year to the count of years that the families have spent asking, and to the count of years that the questions have remained unanswered, and to the accumulation of evidence that the truth of what happened to Miriam García Iborra and Antonia Gómez Rodríguez and Desirée Hernández Folch has not yet been fully told, and that the obligation to tell it fully has not been discharged by anything that has happened in the 3 decades since the night it began. Miriam, Toñi, Desirée, 14 and 15 years old, on the 13th of November, 1992. The night has not ended.